The idea for Drowning, my second book, did come in the air. I was working a flight from Hawaii back to the mainland, a red eye. And I was in the forward galley and I was looking out the like small porthole window in the door. And so I'm looking, out the window and I'm looking at nothing, right? There's nothing out there. It is water. For as far as you can see, it's nothing but water. And I don't know if it was because it was like quiet and a red eye and it's dark out there, but it's like the enormity of the situation and the realization of if something happened and we went down out here, what would we do? How would they find us? How would they save us? How would we save ourselves? Like that moment of just acute awareness of how vulnerable you are in that situation, being, you know, in the middle of the ocean, it never left me. And when I went to write Drowning, my follow-up to Falling, I just knew that it had to be bigger. I wanted to go way bigger than Falling. Just I want to blow it up and just go way bigger than Falling. And so I was kind of like, okay, if I want to do this over water, what would be pretty terrible? What would be pretty awful? And then that's how I landed with the idea of a people alive trapped inside a plane at the bottom of the ocean, dangling on the edge of an undersea cliff. And that was my starting point. And then I just reverse engineered it to, okay, well, what would the conditions have to be in order to make that possible? I feel like most authors, their answer to the question is I start with character and then the story comes from that. I'm the opposite for the type of stories that I write. I start with story and the characters evolve from there. I start with research. I do a tremendous amount of research. And once I understand the world, then I start going, okay, that's the world that I'm playing in. What is the story here? What is the crisis? What does this look like? And how does this work? Then once I know what the story is going to be, it's almost like the players that are needed for the story just sort of like become pretty obvious. I actually said this when I was on tour for Worst Case Scenario, my latest book, just a few weeks ago. I described it like that. And someone in the audience raised their hand, and I love baseball. Baseball is like my life's great love. And they knew that, and they're like, so it's like a Field of Dreams type moment. They just like come out of the cornfield. And I was like, yeah, that is kind of how it is. Like I realize what I need and then they just sort of appear. And he's like, so if you build it, they will come. And I was like, that's exactly right. So once I knew sort of the idea of, like I just described the plane at the bottom, I also knew that I needed a separation, right? I needed somebody above and somebody below that we were trying to get back together. That was going to be kind of the heart, the beating heart of the story was this separation and how to bring them back together. And I decided to do that with a family, with a couple who have separated and are heading towards a divorce. And the father, Will, and his 11-year-old daughter, Shannon, are inside the plane, and her mother and his soon-to-be ex-wife, Chris, is on the surface. And so you've got a whole cast of characters, up with her and the rescue team who are working to save the passengers and the remaining crew down below, these 12 people who are trapped inside this plane who are, as I was saying earlier, a plane is just like, riding a public bus. Next time you're, out in public transportation, just look at the people around you and think, okay, what if something went wrong? It'd be these people. It'd be up to us. And just imagine, these people with you. So there's a elderly couple, there's a nurse, there's sort of a jerky businessman, there's an unaccompanied minor who's traveling by herself. There's just sort of a ragtag group of characters that wouldn't be your superhero A team, that you'd want in that situation. They're children and elderly and the general random everyday people that you're on a flight with. And it's kind of a theme in my books is everyday people in extraordinary circumstances. and I love dropping people like you and me into hot water and seeing what rises, seeing what they do, seeing what comes out. And I think there's more heroic natures in most of us than most of us would think that there is. I think we just haven't had the opportunities to meet the moment. The idea for worst case scenario, actually, the seed was planted when I was doing research for Falling. And I was working as a full-time flight attendant at the time. And as I said, I would use the pilots for my research. I would ask them questions all day long, every day. And not just questions about like policy procedure and like the nuts and bolts of flying, but I would ask them questions about the emotional side of being a pilot, the psychological side of being a pilot. And the question that I would ask was, what's your greatest fear? As a pilot, what is your greatest fear? And one day I had a pilot who looked me dead in the eye and said, my greatest fear is a commercial airliner crashing into a nuclear power plant. Yeah, and I kind of reacted like you just did, sort of taken aback. I didn't know if he was serious or not. So I actually was quite dismissive, and I sort of laughed him off and started, listing all the reasons why I wasn't worried about that. It's like, come on, we live in a post 9/11 world. We know that that could be a threat, and therefore they have shown in studies and with their actions, that these facilities are fortified, that this is not a rational fear. They know it could be a problem, therefore they've done all the work to make sure that it won't be a problem. And I'm going on and on and on, and he's listening to me. And when I finish, he just looks at me again and says, and that's exactly what they want you to think. And it was one of those, like, hairs on the back of your neck stand on edge. I was like, oh, okay. And I didn't ask a follow-up. We kept going, whatever. And so when I went to write my third book, and again, yes, my thought and my motivation is always bigger. How can I go bigger? And so when going through like the catalog of ideas, that I had, I remembered that moment, and I did like a cursory Google search just to be like, was there anything to that? Or was he just pulling my leg or what? And it was not long into that cursory research process that I realized that there was a lot of validity to his fears, and that there was a lot there to work with. And I mean, like, almost so much so that I almost didn't write the book, because the research terrified me so much, and because I wasn't sure I wanted to live in the world that I knew that I would have to live in to write this book. Um, but I guess I'm just masochistic because I went ahead with it anyway. And yeah, that's where the idea for that one came from. I mean, once I connected the dots that the largest nuclear power plant is in like less than an hour from my house, like the largest nuclear power plant in the country is just outside my front door, is kind of upsetting once you realize that there are actually some very valid, very real vulnerabilities within nuclear power facilities. And that, when I'm reading literature written by like former NRC chairs who are like, yeah, there's scenarios that we actually don't have solutions for. Um, it's unnerving. It's real unnerving. And I have yet to figure out a way to write. um I kind of hope I can figure out a way, but so far for me in my writing process, it's like I'm in and I don't come out. Like I'm envious of the writers that are like, I write from 8 to 1, and then I take a break, and then, do 3 hours, and then I have my nights to myself. And like, I don't know how to do that. It's kind of like a 24-hour clock for me, where it's like I'm in, and then I'm researching, and my house looks like, all it needs is red yarn. And then it's like, the feds are going to be knocking on my door. It's stuff taped to the walls. It's a very immersive process for me. And this one was, emotionally the most difficult. I think as I'm writing bigger and bigger stories, and as the stakes are getting higher and higher, it's going to be tougher and tougher on the characters, and there's going to be real human costs. And I'm a deeply empathetic, and I really live through the characters. So this one really took a lot out of me. when the plane crashes, and that happens on page 5, so it's not exactly a spoiler. Sentence 1 of the book is that a pilot, flying at 35,000 feet has a Widowmaker heart attack and dies. By page 5, the plane has crashed and has crashed into this small town in Minnesota, into a nuclear power plant. And so on the ground, we see, the chaos and destruction essentially happen on the ground into this small rural community. And fairly quickly, some of the leads sort of become announced. Joss Dance, she is the regional rep for Nest, which is they're like the emergency response team if there's a nuclear incident. She goes to the power plant where Ethan, who's the one in charge, as the accident happens at the plant, is also a former lover of hers. We got Ethan. We also have Steve, who is Steve Tostig, who is the chief of the fire brigade, the on-site fire brigade at the Clover Hill nuclear power plant. So those are kind of like my 3 main leads, I guess you would say. But this one has a very large ensemble of characters, everybody from, the 6-year-old daughter of one of the firefighters to a first grade school teacher to the president of the United States. So it's a real across the board cast of characters in this one. When we think about the fallout from a nuclear incident like this, is that there's a short term and the long term, right? There's the acute of, if you come into contact with it, yes, it is, I mean, a scenario more horrifying than you even want to envision, the physiological effects of acute radiation poisoning, and also how fast it happens, and unrecoverable that it is, to a person. At the same time, the majority of the problems are going to be long term, right? They're going to be in the cancer that it causes down the road because you've been breathing in this toxin and ingesting it, and it gets in the water, and it gets in the food source, and it gets in the soil, and it gets in the animals, and it gets in everything, and then it just seeps out like a poison. So it was a really tough thing to keep that fear alive when you can't, the thing that you're afraid of, you can't see, you can't smell, you can't taste. It's invisible. This thing is invisible, and it's also not immediate. Yes, it's immediate for the firefighters on the ground and for the people who are coming in contact with it, but the bulk of the story is avoiding future major problems. And that became a real challenge to say, I mean, you can see, people do it all the time with our personal health, with different things. You kick the can down the road and you don't worry about it and you assume that it won't be a problem, but these characters don't have that luxury. So it's hard to write that as, this is an immediate fear that we have to have, even though you can't see it, can't feel it, don't know what's going on.